Thanks for joining me again on another episode of Stand on Guard. This is David Krayden broadcasting to you live from our nation's capital in Ottawa. Special guest today is Professor Lydia Miljan from the University of Windsor. She's also a fellow with the Fraser Institute, one of my favorite think tanks, and I have over the years consulted with them for many, many news stories and projects. So when we come back, we'll talk to Professor Miljan, but I've got a special treat for you before we do that from the Freedom Convoy trial.
The Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie.
We need political change. But we also need to resolve to resist. Yes, please subscribe, like the station, give us the thumbs up right now if you can. We really appreciate it. It helps us beat the YouTube algorithm, and that's always important because if you don't share this station and these broadcasts with your friends and family, I guarantee you YouTube won't do it for me. They won't, because they're really not interested. Before we get to our guest today, I wanted to share this with you because this is incredibly funny. I got to put my glasses on to read this. In 2060, Tamara, Leach, and Chris Barber, organizers of the Freedom Convoy, a protest against vaccine mandates for a virus nobody remembers, arrive at the courthouse to finally face sentencing in what the Guinness Book of World Records has officially declared the longest mischief trial in human history. Court proceedings were briefly delayed after Barber's walker set off the metal detector, and Leach mistook the judge for her grandson. Oh, that is absolutely wonderful. And Tamara Leach actually reposted that and said, "That's just too true." It was spot on. But I have to say, it jokingly says there that it's the longest trial in human history. It's actually the longest mischief trial in human history. It's actually the longest mischief trial in Canadian history. And Lawrence Greenspan, the attorney for Tamara Leach, has told me that privately, that it is actually the longest mischief trial in Canadian history. It's by the time they get a sentence, let's put it this way, it's going to be over 2 years. Yes, 25 months by the time they get a sentence. I was there on day one of this trial, and that was after the Labor Day weekend of 2023. Like, that's almost 2 years ago now, because we're only, 6 weeks away from Labor Day, maybe even 5, actually. So it's absolutely absurd. I'm not going to spend the whole broadcast talking about this. I want to get to my guest, but this is absolutely, and I said it for the last 2 days covering this trial. It's an absurd trial, and for the prosecution, the Crown, to be asking for 7 to 8 years, 7 years for Tamara Leach, 8 years for Chris Barber, is absurd. It's not just an overreach; it's an absurdity, and it's plainly injustice. But anyway, I don't want to keep my guests waiting, and we would like to talk to Lydia. Thank you so much for joining, Professor Miljan. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. I really enjoyed your recent article that was both in the Fraser Institute report and Juno News. And we just call that up. And democracy waning in Canada due to federal policies. And when I saw that article, I said, well, we have something in common because I've been talking about the same thing for the last couple of years, at least. And I found your analysis to be very, very precise. And I just wanted to run through a couple of things here with you because I find this to be not only insightful, but you raise some of the same issues that a lot of us small c conservatives, libertarians are raising as possible problems here. And I'll go through them, and I have specific questions. But you say, why is democracy waning in Canada? You talk about the subsidies, and you talk about the invocation of the Emergencies Act. You talk about Bill C-11. further infringing free speech, federal government spending, which is escalating under Carney even faster than it was under Trudeau, and Bill C-5. This is really where I want to focus the conversation, because I find this to be absolutely frightening where this government is going. But if we could start, if I can get rid of this, if we could start with your analysis of the government subsidizing media, which I find, because as you point out, a lot of people forget this. This was supposed to be a temporary thing during the pandemic, just to sort of infuse some cash into these cash-starved enterprises. I want to ask you, first of all, why do you think this is an example of a waning or a declining democracy? And do you think that the rise of independent and new media will somewhat offset these subsidies and the lack of objectivity from the mainstream media?
Well, thanks for having me on your show, David. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, this is based on the work of Levitsky and Ziblatt. They have a book called How Democracies Die, and they sort of wrote this in the wake of 2016, and they were really quite concerned about Trump. And they're comparative political scientists, and they're sort of making the case that, sure, we notice democracies dying when there's a dramatic coup, when the military is involved, but they argue it's much more insidious than that. No democracy is immune from dying, and that it's the slow erosion of your rights that you really have to be careful about it. And they point out, there's been lots of examples: Nicaragua, Venezuela, Hungary, Ukraine. So there's lots of examples of how there's just this subtle decline in democracy, and it's imperceptible. And so one of they have sort of 5 elements that they say, you should be attuned to these things. If a leader rejects democratic rules, they deny the legitimacy of their political opponents, they tolerate or encourage violence, or they're willing to restrict dissent, including criticism from the media. And so that's where I pick it up, because there's different ways to attack the media. We know that Donald Trump does it by calling them fake news and calling them out and saying it's misinformation. But I think that the Liberals under Justin Trudeau were much more clever about it, because they got into government in 2015 because, quite frankly, they had a fawning media over them. They had an extended honeymoon period, sunny ways. Every selfie he took, every photobomb he did was dutifully recorded by the media. And then something happens in 2019, and the blackface scandal comes out, and they end up winning again, but a minority government. And the media pretty much has sort of gone off Justin Trudeau at that time. And so cleverly, what they say is, the media is in crisis, and they sort of manufacture. When we know the traditional media is in crisis, the business model doesn't work, and so they make the case that we are going to temporarily subsidize them. And this is actually 2019. Prior to the pandemic, they said, we want to give them a little bit of a boost. We want to support the jobs. We want to give subsidies. Salary subsidies is essentially what they argued as a temporary backstop to ensure that these legacy media have a chance to, figure out how they're going to move forward. Well, COVID hits, and then they double down on that. And now those temporary media subsidies are gone. They are now permanent subsidies, with Mark Carney in this year's election vowing to increase them by another $150 million. That's on top of the over $325 million that they're investing into various subsidies for the media. And it's not as if the media have saved jobs. In fact, during the time where they're getting all these subsidies, they actually lay people off, and not including CBC, which has even more subsidies than anyone else. And so what this does is it makes it much more difficult for media organizations to criticize the government, because they are, especially during election campaigns. They might say they're independent and they're not somehow influenced by the subsidies. But when you have one party saying, we're going to give the media more subsidies, and another one saying, not so fast, and that other party focusing much more on social media and non-traditional media, you can see how the coverage could be swayed in one party's direction over another. And that's sort of one of those, it's small, but it's insidious, and it's just a sign that we aren't living in as a free country as we think we are.
I think one of the greatest disappointments for me with the re-election, if you will, of the Carney government and the non-re-election of the Pierre Polyev conservatives was Poilievre's consistent promise to defund the CBC, essentially privatize it. Because I've been a lifelong critic of the CBC. I've written papers on why the CBC has no justification to be receiving a cent in public money, and I think it could probably compete if it's in. I always say this: if it's so good as it says it is, if it's so good, why can't it compete with the private sector? And I think it probably could, because there's certainly an audience for that kind of news in Canada, very much so, probably more so than is in the US. But do you think, like, the rise of the new media, and I'm including my station, I also work for publications like Human Events, The Post Millennial. I write for these Blaze Media. I write for Blaze Media every week as well. These are new media. They have a totally different perspective. And I know people, most of the people in my life never watch CBC. They haven't watched CBC in decades in some cases. They don't read the Globe and Mail anymore. They don't trust it. But they do watch a lot of podcasts and they do read a lot of new media. Do you think that might offset this outrageous subsidization of the mainstream media? Is there some hope there?
It could. I mean, certainly we saw that in the last election campaign, and there's a real digital divide in this country. I think you and I are probably outliers for our age group that we're relying on multiple sources of media, such as social media as well as traditional media. Younger Canadians, the students that I teach, for example, don't watch traditional news, and if they do, they'd watch it on a screen. They wouldn't watch it, on television, sitting next to their mom and dad. And so, what we saw in this election campaign was this huge divide, where prior to the election, all demographics were supportive of Pierre Poilievre. And then when Carney enters the scene, you see a big shift. But you see the shift only in people over the age of 55 primarily. And those are, reliable voters. And so people my age group, essentially white women, and I talked to a lot of white women during the election campaign saying, why'd you change your views, or have you changed your views? And they said, oh, yes. They said, well, we were willing to vote for Carney we were willing to vote for Poilievre before Carney came in, but we just liked Carney better. They liked his credentials. They thought he was a serious person, but also they tended to watch traditional newscasts and read traditional broadsheets. And when I'd say, well, have you, what is it about Poilievre that's turned you off? What's new? And they said, oh, it's not really that we were totally in love with him to begin with. The issue is he's just he's too negative. And you'd ask the follow-up question, well, have you watched any of his social media stuff? Have you watched any of his rallies? And they're like, no. So they'd already turned off. So they weren't even exposing themselves to Poilievre. And so the only frame they had of Poilievre was what they'd heard last year, or what the media that they were consuming were presenting right now. And so, but the media tended to focus on Carney's attacks of Poilievre, saying that he was going to be a sellout, saying that he was going to do Trump's bidding. And so that's an interesting perspective. And then when you look at younger Canadians, they did change their votes, basically 18 to 50, they were like all in with the Conservatives. And both sides, the ballot box question was uniquely different for those two demographics. And I think that's a really interesting story about this election campaign, because I haven't seen that in other election campaigns where older Canadians were consumed about Trump and tariffs, where younger Canadians were like, still need to get a job, still would like to buy my own house and move out of my mom's basement, and they saw that the Conservatives were speaking to them, where the older Canadians weren't even hearing those messages. And so that's where I'm concerned about. I mean, I think that over time, the media subsidies don't matter, because the people who will consume traditional media will be dying out anyway. But then you've got to think about the other aspect of it, and that's Bill C-11. And that's the government was going to, they basically said the CRTC is now going to be able to govern the internet and govern speech on the internet. And there was a huge backlash, and content providers are saying, wait a minute, you can't control what we say. And so they backed off from that, but they did it in another very sneaky sort of sideways is by saying, okay, we won't regulate your speech as a podcaster, but we're going to regulate the content provider. So we're going to regulate YouTube and whoever, any other streaming service. And so if somehow this podcast, for example, didn't comply with the CRTC regulations, they wouldn't go after you, David, but they'd go after the platform that hosts you. And so that still is censorship. It's making the content providers now take a closer look at what's being broadcast on their channels and taking responsibility for it. So they could at any time then say, oh, you don't comply with X, Y, or Z policy, or we're concerned that this violates whatever they, standard practice that they've deemed the CRTC would have.
Yes. The past 2 days I've been following and reporting on the Freedom Convoy trial, the sentencing hearing, which once again has gone way beyond the usual time limit for a mischief trial. 2 days for a sentencing hearing. These people are not going to get closure on this in terms of a sentence until October 7th. Now, clearly, I've seen this trial from day one as a political ruse. This is all about political prisoners being told, don't do it again. And the rest of Canada being told, if you do this, if you oppose the government, and if you oppose the dominant hegemonic narrative in this country, watch out. You're going to go through years of lawfare. You're going to lose $50,000 to $60,000. And at the end of it, you might go to jail. But I had a message this morning from a follower on X who said to me, are you aware of the term anarcho-tyranny? And I said, yes, I remember that. I haven't heard that in years. And so he was good enough to define it for me. And I said, yeah, I do remember it now. But this, of course, is where the government criticizes, persecutes, and eventually jails ordinary citizens for opposing the government, and sort of gets very lax about the real criminals out there, the killers, the rapists, the thieves. They sort of get off with minimal sentences. But if you oppose the government, you could go to jail for 8 years. This has shocked a lot of my American viewers that the Canadian government would actually suggest, well, actually, it's the Ontario government. We have to keep going back to that. This is Doug Ford's court. But the Ontario government, the Crown, wants 8 years in jail for Chris Barber, and they want to expropriate his truck. That, to me, just reeks of communism. This whole thing, to me, has been a show trial, and these people have gone through hell trying to explain why they did what they did. But do you think this trial, and yes, we have the anarcho-tyranny, do you think this trial is another example of declining democracy? Because sometimes I talk exclusively about declining free speech when I should be saying declining democracy in terms of what you're saying in this essay and what the authors of this book said. But would you cite that as another example?
Yeah, absolutely. It is one that I cite in part both because of how they invoke the Emergency Act, which, Federal Court Justice Richard Mosley said that they did not meet the threshold for using their extraordinary powers. And you have to point out to people, and I often do, the timelines, because I think it gets muddled, right? It's back in the past. But let's remember that they made it sound like this was an economic issue, that they had to invoke it because we were losing trade with the United States. But we'll also recall that both the Coutts blockade and the one at Windsor had been cleared the weekend before by the Ontario government using their own emergency powers. So they were, the OPP and other agencies were able to break down those blockades that were actually based on the trade issue, and same thing in Alberta. And then only a week later, the government goes, well, it's really a disaster in Ottawa, and we've got to shut this down. And fair to the people that were suffering under it. I mean, that I have heard from people going, oh, it was a nightmare and all that. But but my position is all protests are irritating. All protests are annoying. I mean, just again, before the pandemic, we had a shut down Canada protest that was in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en Nation for the liquefied natural gas in British Columbia, and they wanted to shut down our rail system. That quietly went away with no invocation of the Emergency Act. So the question is, why is this protest so different? What was it about the Ottawa protest? And again, we see all sorts of protests happening in Ottawa all the time. I mean, you look at the pro-Palestinian protests that go on. That, you could say, hey, they're crossing a much greater line when they're essentially evoking hatred against the Jewish people. They're not just criticizing Israel. They're actually calling for the extermination of Jews, which, as far as I remember, that was considered a hate crime. Yet we don't see mischief charges being laid. We don't see an emergency act being invoked. And so the fact that there was an overreaction by the federal government, they were sort of itchy to use this power that hadn't been used, is quite astounding. And the fact that this has gone on for so long, as you rightly point out, with the prosecution of Leach and Barber, where we can't, they're acquitted on everything except mischief, and somehow mischief is going to give them 7 or 8 years. And everyone's pointed out how we have violent criminals and repeat offenders out on bail the next day, where both Barber and Leach, I believe, spent time in jail while they were waiting trial, and they were incarcerated far longer than those violent criminals. And so, yeah, this does feel very politically motivated as opposed to true public safety. Or, we're not talking about people who vandalize. We're not talking about the G20s, where they're breaking windows. They were annoying. Yes, they made noise. They made life miserable for people in the area, but that is not equivalent to other instances that get a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, well, I listened to the testimony of these poor, downtrodden Ottawa folks, and I was watching the entire protest. I was there every day in these horrible sub-zero temperatures, interviewing people, while CBC sat in their cloistered offices and never ventured outside. But I listened to the stories of these so-called downtrodden Ottawa businesses. They're all upper income people in the market who couldn't actually establish whether or not they'd lost any money during that protest. And I always said, what about the lockdowns? We had rolling lockdowns in Ottawa and throughout Ontario from 2020 right up into the Freedom Convoy protest. And I think that might have had something to do with businesses losing money and businesses closing. But of course, the focus all went to this 2.5-week period where businesses lost money, businesses closed because of the Freedom Convoy protest. And I think it's an absurd charade, but we could go on about that.
Well, I just have a fun anecdote from that time, because the protests were blocking the entrance almost to the university, and where they were staging their stuff was a little mini mall right close to the university, and there's some restaurants that I frequently go to. And so after the convoy ended, I went to my restaurant that I like to frequent and give my business to, and I said, I was like, how'd you do during the convoy? Was it really bad? Did you lose lots of business? They said, oh no, we finally made money because we had been so restricted because of the lockdowns that they were parking in our parking lot and they were doing takeout. And so I was like, yeah, we love the convoy because they actually improved their business. So I do take that sort of the cries of we lost business because of the convoy with a grain of salt, because they were the ones that actually were going into restaurants and buying stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly what I heard, and and what I saw. I went to restaurants who said we've never had it so good, never had so much business, and the LCBO in the market had never had it so good, and it was all trumped up nonsense. But I want to talk to you about Bill C-5 because you mentioned that as another example of declining democracy, and I have been criticized by some of my own viewers for saying Bill C-5 is a horrible bill because it centralizes, as you say, control in the federal cabinet and the prime minister's office. I see Mark Carney as another example of a prime minister who wants to centralize control within the PMO. And even Stephen Harper did that to some degree. And I worked on the Hill during the Harper years, and it was very difficult to do anything without the approval of the PMO. Certainly that continued under Justin Trudeau. I think Mark Carney is going to be the epitome. He's going to be emblematic of PMO power, and I think this bill represents that. But so many people have come to me and said, David, you're completely wrong about Bill C-5. The Conservatives fixed it. They solved the problems in this bill, and you should be saying it's a good bill. And Pierre Poilievre, of course, is continuing to say that the bill is fine now. We fixed it, and it was a bad bill before we made amendments to it. I'm not seeing any evidence of this. Do you see any evidence that this bill was in any way amended sufficiently to make it a good bill?
Well, there's a couple things there. One is, I mean, I'm torn, right? Because I like the idea that we're actually going to get things built, because I really feel like we've had a decade we had the lost decade where nothing got built. We didn't get our pipelines. Had we had the pipelines approved, 10 years ago, we would have had an east-west corridor. We would have had just so many more things happening. We would have had our product going to market. So on that side, you think, yeah, you'd like these things to be done efficiently and quickly. But on the other hand, you've got to really wonder about what does the government mean by national interest, because it's vague language. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get pipelines built. It might mean that we're going to get wind turbines in Lake Erie, which, we had a moratorium on because, the public outcry was like, we don't want wind turbines in our lakes. And so we know that Mark Carney is all in with net zero and with climate change action, which is fine for as long, for what it's worth. But, what does that mean in terms of our economy? What does that mean in terms of what kind of infrastructure we're going to be building? And we also know that the Carney Liberals, much like the Liberals before them, are always beholden to Quebec for their electoral seats, right? So are they going to disproportionately have things in the national interest that support Quebec over, say, Alberta? I mean, full disclosure, I still, even though I live in Ontario, I still feel like an Albertan because that's where I grew up and was raised. But there is a strong case to be made for the oil and gas sector. In fact, I think a strong environmental case to be made for it, because if you have it in the pipelines, it's actually lower emissions than if you're transporting it by rail or by truck, and you're certainly not receiving oil from regimes that don't have the same kind of environmental standards as we do if you're getting it, say, from Saudi Arabia and things like that. So I am torn, but the thing is, we don't know. What's been quite brilliant about Carney is that he has these great platitudes. He makes it sound like he's all in for Canada, but he never really answers a question directly, and we never know what direction we're going to go into. So a lot of it's going to depend on implementation. And I always sort of think about, if Carney were the leader of a different party, would he get the same pass as he has been right now by traditional media? Like, if his label were conservative rather than liberal, I wonder what the hue and cry would be in the national media. There's something about how we label politicians. And so whenever I'm thinking about policies, I try to put aside the labels that we put on them and say, okay, does this make sense on its face value? And so on face value, having so much centralized control over what is in the national interest is worrisome. Pushing out provincial leaders and not consulting with them, as well as Indigenous people, is a recipe for conflict in the future. And so it really depends on what's the strength of the people around the table that he's willing to consult with. And we don't know that as well. I mean, this last week where they had the First Minister's meetings, and he had meetings with Indigenous people, you don't get a really good sense of what those projects are going to be. All we know that there's going to be an office in place in September, but they're still lukewarm even about the idea of an east-west pipeline. And I saw that Wab-Kinew wasn't that in favor, that excited about it. So you have Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario saying yes, and then you've got Manitoba being a holdout. So will the federal government say to Manitoba, well, we need to go through your land to build this pipeline? Or will there be some other thing in the national interest, such as EV mandates? Like, we just don't know.
I thought Carney very effectively co-opted the official opposition during the MP's 3 weeks back in school, which really what it amounted to before summer vacation started again. But are you saying then that the bill is still a bad bill in terms of its centralization of control, despite the endorsement of Pierre Poilievre in the Conservative Party?
Well, I think Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives are in a tough position because they even though they got the best showing they had even before Harper, the fact remains that they were seen as the losers in this, and so they know that Poilievre has this image problem, as I mentioned before, this image that he's too negative. So now he's got to play nice, and he's made statements such as we want Canada to succeed. So I think that was their good faith effort to to say we want Canada to succeed. But in doing so, they were probably hoping that the federal government is going to make good on its commitments to things like pipelines. I think that seemed to be at that time way back in June and just after the election, it seemed like there was a national consensus for pipelines. Whether that holds and whether this bill helps that, I think that's what they're hoping to happen. But we don't know. And so you got to be careful about this kind of legislation, that even though your intentions when you're trying to cooperate with the government may be X, the government might say, oh, well, now we've got carte blanche and we can do whatever we want. And that's the trap that they might have set for themselves for the Conservatives, that they should, that they might have been better to be more careful in not allowing the federal government to have so much centralized power. But perhaps they're also thinking, well, if we get in next time, then look at us, we'll have that central power. And that's the thing about politics, is that everyone people aren't exactly honest brokers, and they have their own self-interests about what they would like the legislation to look like once they're in power. And so maybe the Liberals did their bidding in an offhanded way.
But are you seeing any evidence that the Conservatives actually added any constructive amendments to this bill that would alleviate your concerns about it being over centralization of the project management?
No, not in that part of it. I mean, I agree that the issue, and again, this was part of the Conservatives' argument, and another one that the Liberals co-opted. Remember, the Liberals co-opted the Conservatives' platform, the getting rid of the carbon tax, certainly the whole rhetoric around that we have too much red tape, that we have too many gatekeepers. And so this did fit nicely with the Conservative strategy. So they're in a box, right? Because they had said all along, we have, the regulatory regime is too complex, it's too difficult to get anything built. And so the Liberals said, okay, how about this? And so anything that the Conservatives put out there, they were sort of tied by that language, but they're not thinking about, I don't think they were thinking about the bigger picture, about the centralization of control and the fact that we are putting more power in the hands of the PMO in particular. Because let's face it, it's Carney who's going to make those decisions, not the people around him.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. Wanted to mention, you talked about C11, and of course that was highly controversial. But Bill C-36, the Online Harms Act, which did not pass because Parliament was prorogued, and then, of course, we went to an election. Bill C-36, I consider to be the most dangerous and odious piece of legislation the Trudeau government ever attempted to introduce. Mark Carney has obliquely talked about reintroducing this bill. He says he's worried about misinformation and disinformation and how this might affect the safety of children. Of course, is a complete non sequitur. This has got nothing to do with keeping children safe, but everything to do with keeping the airwaves safe for Liberals. Do you think that Bill C-36, if it's reintroduced by the Carney government, and I'm sure it will be, you think this poses a clear and present threat to democracy in this country, not to mention free speech in general?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, whenever people love, let's save the children, right? Like, kids are watching stuff that you would make your I don't know, I can't even think of an analogy of the garbage that's out there. This bill isn't going to fix that. It's just so easy to get content, but it certainly is a very good way for the government to control political speech. and let's remember that when they first introduced it, I can't remember how long ago because there's been so many iterations of it. The only the only political party that was found in contravention were the Liberals. They're very good at having platitudes and saying, oh, we can't have fake news, we can't have this and that, and then they bold-faced lie about their political opponents. Yet they don't think there should be any consequences to them. So I think that in a free society, people make misstatements, people lie, but it's also, as much as we can be critical of social media and critical of this new world, it's very democratizing, because if I said something outrageous, oh boy, am I going to hear about it. People are going to email me, they're going to go on X or on any social media that they like, and they are just going to double down going, oh, what an idiot, blah blah blah, and that's their right to do so. And then it's up to me to defend myself, or to say, oh, my bad, I shouldn't have said that, or no, you guys are wrong, and I'm going to stand. That's a conversation. That's democracy. The problem, I think, for some is that it's just so out there and vocal, and people aren't savvy about how to differentiate between fact and fiction, and that's on us as citizens. That we've got to learn how to do our own research. We got to learn to say, okay, even if I like something that I'm seeing on whatever channel, and that includes traditional media, because they don't get it right every time either. I did a whole career exposing how they got it wrong, or they only showed one side over another. So it's always incumbent upon the viewer to say, I'm going to double check this, or I'm going to see what other sources are saying the same thing, to see the veracity of it. And I don't think that's the job of the government to do so, because the government itself misleads. I think political leaders of all stripes massage the truth in many different ways to get to obviously to make their case, but that doesn't mean that they are the purveyors of truth in all instances. And so in a democracy, everyone needs to be able to have the right to call out misinformation and untruths where they see it. And it's not the job of the CRT or CRTC or the federal government to do so, to monitor that.
Couldn't agree more with that. And you alluded to how Mark Carney ran in the last federal election essentially as a prototype or a duplicate of Pierre Poilievre. He stole a lot of his policies. He talked the same talk. And at times it looked like the same speechwriter was writing the speeches for both of these men, especially after the election. It was almost scary. In fact, I would say Mark Carney almost patterned himself after other blue liberals like John Turner and Paul Martin, who were always sort of antidotes to the last very, very liberal prime minister. And I say that in a capital and a small sense as well. But since he's become prime minister, we've learned he has 103 different conflicts of interest. We've learned he has investments around the world. We don't know exactly how much he's worth, but we know he's making a heck of a lot of money off of green energy projects, that he's made a lot of money from being an insider as a globalist, as a former governor of the Bank of England, as a former governor of the Bank of Canada. He has his fingers in a lot of financial troughs. And he's also run up a $300 billion deficit since becoming prime minister. And this, of course, is something that would have frightened even Chrystia Freeland last December. She was concerned that $50 billion deficit was going to mean we're going off the fiscal cliff. Well, this is 6 times that we've gone off the fiscal cliff. Mark Carney is clearly not a small C conservative. He's really not a blue liberal. He's as woke as Justin Trudeau ever was. And I think this is all a game. This is all a charade. Just as it was a charade to suggest that he hated Donald Trump with a passion, the U.S. was the enemy, and he's going to fight them tooth and nail, when in fact, he obviously seems to get along very well with Donald Trump. He admires Donald Trump to a large degree, and he's been totally ineffective in standing up to Donald Trump like he said he would be. So once again, play acting. But do you think Mark Carney is potentially going to be worse for the Canadian economy than Justin Trudeau was?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It'd be nice to see a budget. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
and I mean, they had to backtrack from that. Recall that, you know, the finance minister, after their first cabinet meeting, said, "Oh, we're not going to have a budget this year." It's like, oh my god! And then a couple days later, Carney had to acquiesce and say, "Yeah, we'll have a fall budget, not just an economic statement." It's too soon to tell. I mean, you know, you have these demands on the federal government, in part because of Trump and the tariffs and their need to shore up certain industries. You also have our new commitments for defense spending. So that's going to be a big ticket. But then at the same time, they're saying we're going to do across the board cuts, and there's going to be cuts to the public sector. So they're in for a bumpy ride. They're in for a bumpy ride from both the left and the right, and we'll just have to see how he does it. I mean, he certainly is a different kind of politician, and this is sort of what the How Democracies Dies authors talk about. They said, got to be a little bit careful about outsiders, because the outsiders sort of run a wave of populism. They get people excited about them because they're outsiders, because they have sort of this business experience, but the political people in politics, in the party system, they allow that to happen because they think, oh, once this guy comes in, we'll be able to control them. And oftentimes they aren't able to control them because they have a life of their own. And so we'll have to see what happens with the Liberals under Mark Carney, if there's going to be rifts under. Are they a party that just wants to be in power, or are they a party of ideologues? When you look at his front bench and that famous picture of their, his new cabinet when after they won election, the front row were all people who had been in Justin Trudeau's cabinet, who had been full-throated endorsements of carbon tax and all sorts of different initiatives that Carney threw out the window. So are they going to be putting pressure on him, or are they just saying, oh, we're glad we got the gig and we're going to stay in power with you? And if that's the case, if they're the latter, that they're not going to criticize and that they're going to go full bore with him, then that's going to be a bit scary, because then he can basically do whatever he wants, and we'll just have to see who is in it for. Is he in it for the Canadian economy, the Canadian people, or is he in it for his globalist friends and his ideas?
Well, my final question, and that was going to be my question, but you prompted me to ask you this: would you consider Mark Carney to be a populist?
Well, I guess I think of it. Insofar as he stole the conservative platform, I think he is, in that respect. You gotta. I mean, I do feel bad for. I don't belong to any political party, but I do feel bad for the Conservatives. They worked so darn hard to eke away and prosecute basically the Liberals and the NDP, and they were highly successful in doing so. And just when they were about to seize power, in swans in Carney, steals their platform and takes the ring. So you gotta feel for them. So in that respect, I don't know if he's a populist, but I'm certainly interested to see how easily he will adopt the policies of others to get where he wants to go. So I'm not sure I have a good descriptor for him yet.
Well, I think it's difficult to know what in earth Mark Carney is, except somebody who aggrandizes power around him,
Yeah.
and that seems to be his raison d'être. But I agree with you, by the way, that I felt for Pierre Poilievre. I don't belong to any political party either. I criticize all political parties. Obviously I come from a small C conservative perspective. I've known Pierre Poilievre for over 20 years. I knew him before he was even elected as an MP. And I can say this must have been a very, very difficult decision for him. Very difficult, because he could taste being prime minister. He was that close.
Yeah.
And to see that support erode day after day, week after week, it must have been a horrible experience for him. And I do sympathize with that. But thank you so much, Professor Miljan, for joining me today. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. And thank you for sharing your thoughts, your expertise, your wisdom, and your opinions on these issues today. It's always a pleasure to hear somebody who actually understands what's going on in this country, and you do that very well. So thank you, and I hope you can join us again.
My pleasure, David. Nice being here.
Bye for now.
Bye.
That, of course, was Professor Lydia Miljan of the University of Windsor. She's also a fellow, senior fellow with the Fraser Institute. Fantastic group. I encourage you to have a look at their material. We'll come back in a minute with some concluding remarks. Yes, thanks for joining us again today. I want to say the last 2 days covering the Freedom Convoy sentencing hearing, which I fully admit, I thought when I first went there Wednesday morning that we were going to get the sentence. I really didn't think this was going to be another 2 days of the lawyers sparring. And if you had told me that we're not going to get a sentence till October 7th, I wouldn't have believed it, because when I talked to Tamara Leach at the beginning of Wednesdays, she was optimistic, of course, and she told me, as I've told you, I win either way. We win either way, because she still feels very strongly that she did the right thing, and I think she did do the right thing. But she was thinking that they'd have a verdict by at least August 15th, and it must be difficult. Well, I know it's difficult to think you've got to wait till October to have closure on this. And to me, it just represents what this trial has been about. And thank you to whomever sent me that this morning. I haven't got your X account in front of me, but whoever reminded me of that term, anarcho-tyranny, it is so apropos to where Canada is right now, where we crush dissent. We keep the citizens in line. We keep the citizens quiet, and we let people who are convicted of manslaughter, they get 6 years. But we want our political opponents in jail for 8. That's what this country has become. It's a third world dictatorship. It's an embarrassment. And I've just written a piece for Blaze Media where I argue that Canada is so out of step with the United States, and even increasingly with European countries, that it is embarrassing. We are still a woke country that wants to punish our political opponents with jail time. This is what Joe Biden did. Joe Biden threw his political opponents in jail. Donald Trump is actually not doing that. He's getting rid of illegal immigrants. But no, he's not going around rounding up Democratic supporters and throwing them in jail. The liberal government in this country, they have done that with so many people attached to the Freedom Convoy. And the message to you and I, don't try it. Don't try it yourself, or else this is going to happen to you. It might end up that you're not going to jail at the end of this, but the process is the punishment. And that's what this has all been about. Making sure you and I don't go out and protest too loudly. Because if you do, you're going to go through what Tamara Leach and Chris Barber went through. You might even have your truck expropriated by the commie government. I don't use that phrase loosely. But for a government, and this is Doug Ford, people should be asking Doug Ford every day. His corpulent figure stands in front of the media. People should be asking him, media should be asking him, Doug Ford, why do you want Chris Barber's truck? Why are you expropriating Chris Barber's truck? What's in it? Why do you want this? What is your real agenda, Doug Ford? Because let's not forget, this whole trial is in a provincial courthouse that happens to be in Ottawa. A lot of people think because it's in Ottawa, it's a federal court, and this is Justin Trudeau or Mark Carney. This is actually Doug Ford, who is in the pocket of Mark Carney and was in the pocket of Justin Trudeau. And he just loves the work they did. And he was the first premier to say, good job, Justin Trudeau, with your Emergencies Act. You're finally getting these people. So that's who we should be asking questions about. Questions two. Doug Ford, why do you want Chris Barber's truck? Why do you want Big Red? Try to answer that one, Doug Ford. Thank you for watching today, folks. It's been a pleasure. I'll be back again tomorrow at 10 a.m., the usual time. This has been David Krayden broadcasting to you live from our nation's capital in Ottawa. God bless this country, if it's still possible. And Godspeed to all of you. Be back tomorrow. Adieu for now.